Very welcome to this talk on Caravaggio, which we've decided to do between the four Belfast churches of the NSPCI, because of course we're lucky enough to have in Belfast at the moment the Supper at Emmaus from the National Gallery in London and the Taking of Christ from the Gallery in Dublin. And it's a wonderful, wonderful occasion. They're two fantastic pictures. And so we thought we'd just do a little evening centred around them. And if you haven't already got a glass of wine, I'll give you a couple of minutes to grab a glass before I start. And make sure you're in the right spot that you can see the screens and see everything that I'll be talking about. And it's lovely to see so many of you here. My name is Isabella Evangelisti. Most of you know me. I recognise all your faces, but I probably won't know all your names. And I'm an art historian, retired art historian. I just do this for fun now. So, I just wait for the last few to get served, and then I'll start. Now, these are the two pictures. I presume some of you have already been over to see them. If you have, you'll see that they have been beautifully hung over there in a lovely little room, just the two paintings on their own. If you haven't yet seen them, I hope that after tonight you'll be inspired to go and have a look. It's so much better than looking at books or slides. So the two paintings that we have are the Supper at Emmaus from 1601 and the Taking of Christ from just a couple of years later. And they're both biblical subjects, as were most of Caravaggio's works. In the Supper at Emmaus, he shows us an episode from Luke's Gospel. And it's the episode when, after the crucifixion, two dispirited disciples, Luke and Cleophas, are walking along the road to Emmaus, and they're joined by a stranger whom they invite to dine with them at an inn. And together the three men enter the inn to share a meal, but it's only in the blessing of the bread that they recognize the stranger as Jesus, whom they had thought to be dead. Now, Caravaggio takes a particular moment in the story. He takes the shock of recognition as the figure on the right throws wide his arms in amazement. His left hand virtually reaches out into our space. And the figure on the left grips the arms of his chair and begins to rise, also jutting his right elbow into our space. So these little compositional devices make us feel that we are physically present in the sacred moment. Indeed, that space between the two disciples and the front of the table, it seems to leave room for us to draw up a chair and join in the meal. Also present at the back is the innkeeper. He's a more passive figure. He's a witness who doesn't realize the importance of what's happening. So he sort of stands for the unconverted one. You'll notice that his shadow is cast on the wall, and it makes a play on the idea of the halo, which is traditional in the depiction of saints or sacred figures. But here it's a splodge of darkness rather than light. And it suggests that the light of God emanates from Christ. It's in him, and you see how lit his face is. There's a strong contrast too in the figural types. Christ is serene and youthful, the light, as I say, falling on his face, his garment of the richest red. But the disciples either side of him are rough-faced, bearded, poorly clothed. One on the left has holes in his elbows. They're all connected together through their expressive hand gestures. On the table in front of them, there's this very simple meal of what looks like a boiled chicken, rather unappetizingly, and fruit, and of course bread and wine, significant of the Eucharist. So Caravaggio is depicting a story from biblical history, but brings it into the present moment in several ways. Now, the present moment, of course, is his present moment, the beginning of the 17th century. He involves the viewer spatially in the picture, as I've described, through these expansive gestures. And then you'll notice that the disciple on the right is wearing a scallop shell on his garment, which is the mark of the pilgrim. More about that in a moment. And they'll also notice the shadow cast by the basket of fruit at the front of the table is in the shape of a fish, the symbol of Christianity. The scene represents essentially the first celebration of the Eucharist after the resurrection, and it has echoes of the Last Supper, which the disciples had celebrated with Jesus on Good Friday. And the viewer is reminded that each and every celebration of the Eucharist is as valid and sacred as that had been shared by Jesus and his disciples. So the realism of the painting style is intended to remind us of the reality and the truth of the Christian message, to connect there, here and now with the historical past. In the other picture, The Taking of Christ, Caravaggio depicts the moment of Christ's arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. It shows the precise moment of Judas' kiss of betrayal and the soldiers moving in to capture Jesus, who stands submissively awaiting his fate. It's an episode that's in all of the Gospels, of course, because it's in the very important part of the Christian story. But only John of the 4 Gospels makes reference to torches being held. In this case, it's a lamp being held up, but light is the significant element. Again, you have that interplay of hands that is very important to the composition. Christ's are intertwined in a gesture of submission. Judas's hand grasps his shoulder, and the armor-clad arm of the soldier, who's clearly a 17th century figure and not a Roman soldier, reaches over Judas to lay hold of him like some great carapace of a huge black insect. The fleeing figure on the right, who's John, of course, in the biblical text, throws up his hands in fear as he runs. And their 3 heads, Judas, Jesus, and John, are joined together under his billowing cloak as he runs. They can be seen to represent time, past, present, and future, and the coming of a new dispensation. On the right of the picture, the hand holding up the lantern to illuminate the scene is that of Caravaggio himself. This is a comment on the art of painting, which is a collaboration of the hand, eye, and mind, of course. And by putting in a self-portrait into a picture like this, it's a kind of an act of bravura, as he shows himself in the artist's vital role of illuminating the truth. It's pictorially tricky, though, because the light is actually falling on the scene from somewhere to front left, because it's shining directly on Jesus and Judas's face. So he's only lighting the scene in a theoretical sense. So it's a tricky little thought that he's having, a little play of words. The contrast in both pictures is very dramatic, of light and shade. This is a quality known as chiaroscuro, simply meaning light and dark. But it's a lovely word, chiaroscuro. And the colours, rich and sumptuous, both trademarks of Caravaggio's style. What's very, very unusual is in The Taking of Christ, the close-up view. It would be much more usual to paint a history scene like this, a multifigural composition, in a recognisable contextual space. In this case, you'd expect it to be in a landscape, the Garden of Gethsemane. He's so far of his time, ahead of his time, Caravaggio, he's almost anticipating the cinematic viewpoint, which is so familiar to our eyes that we won't recognise how radical and different it was at that time. The figures are packed close together in this very shallow field with no background or extraneous detail. We can feel the clamour, we can almost hear the shouts and the sounds of the jostling crowd. And again, religiously speaking, the viewer is placed right in the scene as a witness to Christ's agony. Both paintings are characterised too by very expressive faces. Though if you notice the different face of Jesus in each one, in The Taking of Christ, it's our usual idea of a thin, bearded face. In the Supper, it's a much plumper, younger, angelic-looking face. Now, what he has done here is taken just a few words from Mark's Gospel, which says, not even referring to Emmaus as a place, but Mark says, after that he appeared in another form unto two of them as they walked and went into the country. So in another form, Caravaggio, in his realism, is taking that to mean, yes, he would have had to have looked different for them not to recognize him. So everything has to be realistic for him. It has to be believable in that sense. There's also, details to note. The Savonarola chair on the left of the supper, this lovely curved chair, which will appear again in several paintings. You can notice that the disciple on the right in the supper, Cleophas, is the same as the second soldier in the other picture, same model. And the other thing to notice, of course, are the fine still life details. The fruit basket that juts over the table, it looks like it's just balancing on the edge, and it gives a real depth of space to the scene. And then the actual armour of the soldier on the taking of Christ. It's important to remember that Caravaggio, as you will hear later, always carried a sword, even when it was forbidden to do so. He was from Milan, and so Milan was the centre of armoury production and sword production, and most people from Milan were into their swords. Now, having looked at the pictures, we'll come back to those pictures, but I just want to give you a bit of historical background about Caravaggio and his early beginnings. His name was Michelangelo. His first name was Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. So his name comes from the place name, his name of his hometown. He was born in Milan, and his father, Fermo Merisi, was a stonemason or architect to the Marquis of Caravaggio, which lies just 35 kilometres to the east. In 1576, the entire family moved to the town of Caravaggio to escape an outbreak of plague. This was to no avail, however, as sadly in 1577 his father, both parental grandparents and his uncle all died of the plague, as did a fifth of the entire population of Milan. But through his mother, Caravaggio had important connections. She was connected to the Sforzas family, and they were the Dukes of Milan, who were in turn connected by marriage to the Colonna family. Italian history at that time is all about powerful families. The Marchesa of Caravaggio was Costanza Colonna. She came from a family that were very high up in the papal nobility. There had been a Colonna Pope, Martin V, and he was famous for ending the Great Schism, where there were two papacies, one in Rome and one in Avignon, France. He restored the papacy to Rome and established the papal supremacy in the Western Christian Church. So Milan was actually under the rule of the Spanish, under Philip II, succeeded by Philip III. But nevertheless, this connection to the Colonna family would prove very useful to Caravaggio in later life. He was born on September the 29th, 1571, just 8 days before a very important battle, the Battle of Lepanto, in which the combined Christian forces of Europe defeated the Ottomans. Costanza's father, Marc Antonio Colonna, commanded the Pope's fleet in that battle. Now, the victory was attributed to, and this is where I beg the indulgence of the non-Catholics in the room, it was attributed to the intervention of the Virgin Mary. And you're going to hear a lot of that tonight. And the Feast of the Rosary was introduced in 1573 in thanks for the miracle. The church in Milan was ruled over by a very interesting person called Cardinal Carlo Borromeo, and he was a zealous reformer who was eager to put into practice by any means necessary, and I mean even the use of his personal army, his familia armata, or armed family, his reforms. The dogmatic principles of the Counter-Reformation as outlined in the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent had spent 16 years, from 1537 to 63, working out its theological response to the Reformation, because it was sincerely afraid of the reformers. And don't forget, Milan is right close to that border with Switzerland. So the Reformed Church was very, very close indeed. Borromeo was very, very influential and strong in Milan, but he didn't always succeed in his aims. For example, he tried to ban carnival, and the Milanese weren't having any of that. Carnival was precious to them, so he didn't succeed in that. The thing that you might be most familiar with that he did introduce was the confession box. And that was in an attempt to restore the sacraments. He felt that if people had a bit of privacy, they might be more likely to tell their sins to the priest. So, to defend the Catholic Church against the teachings of Luther and Calvin, the Council of Trent restated the importance of the priesthood and the seven sacraments, the importance of good works as well as faith, the official Catholic interpretation of the Bible, the importance of pilgrimage, and you remember the scallop shell on Cleophas's garment, and the contemplation of Jesus' life and the veneration of the saints and martyrs. The Council also addressed itself directly to art. Influenced by Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, it believed in the visualization of Christ's suffering. So it insisted that subjects for paintings should be derived from the life of Jesus and the life of the saints, particularly the early Christian martyrs. The paintings should be made in such a manner as their message was very, very clear. They spoke simply and directly to people, many of whom would have been illiterate, so that they would encourage a greater devotion among the Catholic masses. Now, that's the history bit out of the way. After the family was decimated by the plague in 1577, Caravaggio's mother raised 5 children in relative poverty. There was a system of free secondary school education, which Caravaggio would have been entitled to as a child of the skilled artisan class. But at the age of 13, he was apprenticed to a painter called Simone Peterzano, who described himself as a pupil of Titian, but more like a follower of Titian, and today not regarded as anybody very special in the history of art. Traditionally, training for an artist would have concerned preparing the colours, preparing the grounds, which would have been either wooden panels or canvases or walls, practice in drawing, copying from paintings, prints or sculpture, fresco painting, which is painting in wet plaster with plaster, and the study of anatomy and perspective. We must assume, because he signed a contract of training, that Caravaggio did have some training in some of these areas. But it's interesting that not a single drawing by his hand remains. And even under X-ray, none of the paintings have underdrawings. So he wasn't interested in drawing, clearly, and that would have been the basis of training for most artists at the time. He never painted in fresco, although he was asked to do so at one stage. And we can only assume he would have been employed in painting still life details in Peterzano's work, and possibly in helping with portraits. He learned to paint in the Lombardian style, that is, with a focus on naturalism, looking at the natural world, looking at the figure. This is an influence that came from further north, from Flanders and the Spanish lowlands, modern-day Holland, where artists had pioneered the use of oil paint, and with oil paint on canvas you could paint with much more detail and much more naturalism, whereas fresco painting was favoured in more southern parts of Italy. The Reformation in the north had also led to the decline of church patronage and the emergence of lower genres of art. So landscape and still life painting became popular, though still life was considered the lowest of the genres. Now, looking at Pietrangano's work, it's hard to see that Caravaggio learned anything at all. So we must assume he was largely self-taught as an artist. There is very little information on his activities between leaving the master's studio and his arrival in Rome, when his fame began, and no paintings at all from this period survive. So, I mean, it basically looks like the 4 years he was on the DOS. He was not attending lectures, put it that way. We do know, however, from where a great source of what we know about Caravaggio from court records, that he left Milan under a cloud concerning a violent affray, and so his notoriety began. There are two very short records. One version reads, "Being disturbed and contentious because of quarrels, he fled from Milan." The other, more alarmingly, states, "Because he had killed one of his companions, he fled the country." Either way, he arrived in Rome in 1592, aged 21, with nothing but some prestigious connections. He may have been received at the Palazzo Colonna, where the Marchesa was in residence. And as the home of the papacy, who was by now Clement VIII, Rome was the centre of the art world, and it was full of rich and powerful patrons, the princes of the church. First, he would have scratched around looking for journeyman work, possibly painting some freelance portraits. And for just 8 months or so, he worked in the studio of the Pope's favourite fresco painter, Cesare. But once again, he left under a cloud. There was some kind of fracas, some kind of fight, and he was gone. But he would have been very, very frustrated in Cesare's studio. He would have been employed again in painting what were considered the unimportant details of large altarpieces. And this is not what Caravaggio wanted. From the earliest age, despite lack of training, he had the greatest belief in his own talent, and he craved status and recognition. So what he did was he began to paint speculatively, hoping he could sell his pictures on the open market. And he began to paint pictures of the characters he would have been familiar with from the streets, the gypsies, prostitutes, thieves and gamblers from the taverns he frequented, but treated in a very picturesque and theatrical way. This entire genre was Caravaggio's own invention, the low-life drama, showing figures from the streets he knew, like the gangs of what were called marmotti, who cheated the gullible at cards and dice, and bravi. These were mercenaries back from war, armed, on the lookout for any opportunity to rob and steal, or the fortune tellers who stole from the people who were captivated by their looks. Gypsies were very popular themes in songs and theatre. In the Commedia dell'arte, they were portrayed as exotic and colourful. But in fact, on the streets of Rome, as you can imagine, they were rounded up by the police as thieves and beggars. And card playing was a very popular pastime, though the church preached against gambling. But paintings of these forbidden kinds of subjects could be safely enjoyed in this allegorical way. They were cautionary tales warning of the dangers of avarice and lust. It was painting the life of the street in an acceptable way for an elite audience. Caravaggio had by now around him a group of like-minded friends, badly behaved friends, in other words, mostly artists, including Mario Minetti and Orazio Gentileschi, whose name is now more famous as the father of Artemisia Gentileschi, but he was a contemporary of Caravaggio's. In the card sharps, you can see the young gentleman is being cheated by two of these bravi. And if you notice, as I said, his friends modelled for him, the young man being cheated and the young man cheating him with his back to us are actually one and the same person. So it's a little a little play and also handy to have your friends pose for you when you're absolutely penniless. Now, I know a lot of you know probably most about Caravaggio was that he was badly behaved. And I don't want to make excuses for his bad behaviour because he was a genuine bad boy. But just to sort of give it a bit of context, Italy was made up of a lot of different states, and they all had powerful cities, and they had a very developed mercantile culture, and so they were much more socially fluid than monarchical systems. Back in 1528, a man called Baldassare Castiglione had written the Book of the Courtier, and this would advise gentlemen on how to attain gentlemanly demeanour, and expert swordsmanship was considered a very necessary attribute in anyone seeking to increase their social status. It was thought that nobility, or nobilità in the Italian, was not something you had to be born with. You could acquire it, you could learn it. And you learned it through your behaviour, through your dress, and as I say, sword fighting was a definite part of it. So the regular street brawling that Caravaggio and his friends were involved in was not that, but it was an aberration of that kind of honour system, a kind of jockeying for position in a very, very competitive and fluid environment, where a stroke of luck could make your name overnight, or you could starve to death just as easily. Caravaggio always carried a sword. He was regularly picked up for fighting and carrying illegal weapons. And as I say, he came from Milan, the centre of swordsmanship and manufacture. And with these young guys on the street, and he wasn't alone, there were gangs of them all over Rome. This was normal behaviour at the time. The aim was to deliver a sfregio, a scar on the cheek, the mark of, and why you did that was if anybody dishonoured you. Now, it was very easy to dishonour Caravaggio. You only had to look twice at him. And so that's what they were at. But at a higher social level was a kind of acceptable social behaviour that had become an aberration on the streets of Rome. A man called Cardinal Del Monte bought these two paintings, possibly through another of Caravaggio's friends, the dealer Constantino Spata. And he bought them very, very cheaply because Caravaggio was just trying to get by, pay the rent and buy a bottle of wine. But they were an immense success, and immediately copies were wanted. Cardinal Del Monte, this is him, was an intellectual, a courtly and sophisticated man originally from Venice. He had had his own stroke of luck in life. He worked originally as a secretary for a cardinal, one of the Medici cardinals. And the Medici cardinal resigned his position when his brother died because he wanted to go home and take over the family dukedom in Tuscany. It was probably worth more. Whereupon he persuaded the Pope to make Del Monte cardinal in his place and left him in residence in the Medici Palazzo Madama. So Del Monte was not rich himself, but he's living in this beautiful palazzo in Rome, and he was very, very fond of leisure pursuits, art, theatre, and especially music. He was part of a circle of very erudite and sophisticated churchmen who delighted in collecting and patronage. Part of the circle was also Vincenzo Giustiniani, a wealthy banker who lived just opposite in the Palazzo Giustiniani. And Del Monte was very attracted by this new youthful genius of Caravaggio. The musicians on the left here was Caravaggio's first painting commissioned directly by Del Monte. There was already a long tradition of musical paintings, particularly in Venice, And in Venice, they were usually pastoral pictures filled with shepherds and shepherdesses playing lutes in imitation of some rural idyll from the ancient classical past. There were also a tradition of musical performance, but what Caravaggio offers us is a depiction of a rehearsal, which was very new and unique. Two musicians are playing. The lute player is again his friend Mario Meniti, and the cornetto player, the one at the back, is Caravaggio himself. They are posed to accompany the solo singer with his back to us, while in the background, a winged figure, a cupid, toys with some grapes, an allegory of love, presumably. We know Caravaggio played the guitar. We know this from a court record, when he was accused by his landlady of playing loudly outside her house and singing lewd songs at midnight. That was one of his crimes. That was one of the lesser ones. This is interesting musically, because in the early 1500s, there began a shift in music from polyphony or choral singing to monody or solo performance. It was thought that with a single voice, the words could be heard more clearly and therefore the emotion better understood. It was called the stile rappresentativo because it emulated normal speech and it made a more direct emotional connection to the listener. This style led to the division into soloist and chorus, and from there directly to the invention of opera. Now, Emilio de Cavaliere, who is widely credited with writing the first opera, was indeed a friend of Del Monte's and part of his musical circle. And this new style coincided with a rise in the popularity of the female voice and the castrati. Castrati are these poor young men who were castrated in order to prevent their voices from falling, to keep the voice in the higher register. Del Monte had in his Palazzo the music camerino, which housed his collection of instruments and scores, and where guests would gather for musical evenings, and it was decorated with this painting and others like it. He fed and housed musicians as well as painters in his household, and they would perform and paint for room and board in return. His friend Giustiniano also had a similar camerino, and he wrote a discourse on music and also commissioned this musically themed painting, The Lute Player, from Caravaggio. So both men were clearly very, very serious about their music, and they were amateurs, but they were very skilled amateurs. The lute player depicts one of these poor men, castrato singer. He was called Pedro Montoya, and he was a singer in the Sistine Chapel Choir. And he's painted in an ancient costume to suggest the music of Orpheus. He's playing from a sheet of readable music. It's madrigals by a Flemish composer. And the book underneath is a book, Roger, you like this, on the bass. This poor man is never going to sing the bass part. Interestingly, in this picture, the flowers, the carafe of flowers, were added by another artist, Jan Bruegel, a Flemish artist who was visiting Rome. And this is an unusual decision because we've seen Caravaggio was so good at still life. But what it probably is a bit of a collector's affectation. He wanted these two great artists in the one picture. And indeed, the pictures can be read as an homage to patronage, such an important thing for any artist trying to establish a reputation in Rome. More fruit and flowers. The basket of fruit at the top is credited with being the first ever Italian still life painting. I've already said that still life was regarded as the lowest of the genres. Michelangelo, the famous Michelangelo, had famously said it was for idiots and women. Caravaggio, on the other hand, argued that it took just as much skill as painting the human figure. Still life like this, painted with such illusionistic skill, the reason for it is rooted in a famous story from ancient Greece about two painters, Zeuxis and Parrhasius. And Zeuxis painted a bunch of grapes that were so lifelike that the birds came down and pecked at them. He challenged his friend Parrhasius to do better. Parrhasius painted a curtain, and he invited Zeuxis to come and pull back the curtain to reveal his painting. When Zeuxis tried and realized the curtain was a painted curtain, he conceded defeat on the basis that he had fooled the birds, but Parrhasius had fooled an artist. So this is a story about the power of art to deceive the eye, and that's what Caravaggio was about. Intense, utter, convincing realism. And he had to challenge the ancients and establish his superiority in this way. In the painting, the fruits all show signs of rot and decay, and it's an absolute tour de force of naturalistic painting, but it is also symbolic because signs of death and decay were interpreted as vanitas and served as a warning about taking the pleasures of the world too seriously to the detriment of the immortal soul, to remind us we are all going to die and think about what will happen to you then. It was painted on a previously used canvas, which was probably the possession of his friend, another painter, Prospero Orsi. And I only mention that because Orsi was described rather ominously as the henchman of Caravaggio. Versions of the basket of fruit, as you can see, are seen in the other paintings. The boy with the basket of fruit and the Bacchus, and we've already seen it in the Supper at Emmaus, perching on the front of the table. The Bacchus here from 1597 is sort of the masterpiece of the youthful works, and again it was painted for Del Monte. Del Monte, by the time of his death, although not a rich man, had 600 paintings in his collection, including dozens by Caravaggio. Bacchus was the god of inspiration and anarchy, and again he's posed by Mario Minetti. We should know him by now. But Bacchus, or Diogenes in the Greek version, was also a prefiguration of Christ because the grapes wine association with the Eucharist, and also there was a myth about his death and resurrection, Dionysus. Del Monte gave the painting to his Medici friends, and they left it in the basement where it stayed for 400 years. And it's now in Florence, in the Uffizi. Now, another point about Caravaggio that all of you are aware of, I'm sure, is the talk about his sexuality. And some of these early works in particular are taken as proof of his homosexuality. There were also rumours about Del Monte. And people think that he was gay, or that they're trying to portray the love that dare not speak his name. That's a little oversimplistic. Yes, absolutely, there is certainly are homoerotic elements to the pictures. But we have to be careful that we should contextualize that homoeroticism in a poetic understanding of courtly love, at least ostensibly and at least officially. They were conversazioni, they were called, paintings designed to stimulate erudite and cultured discussion more than anything else. Having said that, Caravaggio most probably had male lovers. He definitely had female lovers. He was sexually ambiguous, as he was ambiguous in so much else, but he never, ever committed to anyone. We know the names of Caravaggio's women, and they were referred to as Caravaggio's women because they too were often cited in court records because they were all prostitutes. We know Lena, Anna, Isabella, because they crop up again and again for violent affray and all of those crimes from the streets. At the same time that Caravaggio was painting his boys and fruits and flowers and musical pictures, he was also painting his first religious pictures. The penitent Magdalene, probably painted for Doria Aldobrandini, the niece of yet another cardinal. She was the most fashionable female saint because she was seen as a sinner who repented. And so she appealed to this ascetic branch of Catholicism. She was the patron saint of sinners and penitents. During the Renaissance, the tradition had been to treat her erotically, as you can see in Titian's version, because the story of her casting off her costly garments and jewels gave an excuse to paint a female nude. Caravaggio avoids this approach. The early eroticism is replaced by a much more austere piety to suit the age. The painting has this weird low viewpoint. We're looking down on her, and we're told, the story goes, that Caravaggio was walking along a street and he saw a girl sitting on a stool dyeing her hair, and that gave him the idea of the pose. He depicts her in contemporary dress and looking very like just an ordinary young Roman woman, letting down her hair, casting aside her jewellery, and there's actually, you won't see from there, but there's a tear running down her cheek. Her attribute, as all saints have an attribute, and Mary Magdalene's was the jar of ointment with which she is supposed to have anointed Christ's feet, is not there except in the pattern of her dress. If you see right at her feet, there's a kind of an urn decoration on the damask of her dress. So the symbolism is hidden inside the naturalism, which was much more important because he wanted immediacy, relevance, the true meaning of the penitent woman, not just a pretty picture. The model this time was Anna Bianchini, and again another prostitute who will appear later. And I mention all these girls because they're probably what got him into his worst trouble, which is to come. The St. Catherine on the right-hand side is, she was sanctified for defending her faith against the Roman Emperor Maxentius's 50 philosophers. So she's the patron saint of scholars. And she was tortured on the wheel. Now she would normally carry, here we have her attribute shown. It would normally be a tiny little wheel symbolizing the wheel of torture, but he's put in a great big Roman cartwheel that he rolled in off the street. The wheel was hit by a thunderbolt. You can see it's broken, and instead she was beheaded with a sword, which she holds in her hand. And on the ground at her feet is the palm leaf, which is another attribute, a sign of a martyr. And her iconography is much more conventional, although also in contemporary dress you can see that she's got a halo in this case. And but in appearance, again, she is a real modern woman. This one is Felide Melandroni. A telling detail, I don't know if you can see, but she's got a crooked finger on her left hand. And there is a court record that she was attacked by another prostitute who wounded her hand. So we know that happened. But the fact that Caravaggio painted it that way, not just in this painting, but in another painting, shows that he was painting exactly what was in front of his eyes. He wasn't going to prettify for the sake of the story. For the sake of making her a saint, he wasn't going to fix her finger. Now, that's what I say about these women all being prostitutes. And they were the women who would pose for him, naturally. Respectable, normal, married women or daughters wouldn't have posed for an artist. But they were protected by a man called Ranuccio Tomasoni. He was a pimp, and he was an adversary of Caravaggio's, possibly because the girls sat for him, possibly because they slept with him. But is a long-running feud developed between Caravaggio and Tomasoni. Now, the paintings, if you notice, are getting a bit darker, and the darker phase of Caravaggio's work is called tenebrism. So chiaroscuro becomes tenebrism, which is an extreme form of chiaroscuro, where the figure is staged in a pool of light, but all around is shadow, as in the St. Catherine. The Church of San Luigi dei Francesi was the church of the French community in Rome. And there was a private chapel owned by Matteo Contarelli, the cardinal, and they wanted a painting in time for the Holy Year, which would be 1600. And Del Monte put forward Caravaggio for this very important commission, his first public commission, and the thing he had always longed for. It seemed his time had come. It was his first full-length figural composition, and he began with the martyrdom scene on the right, but it proved so difficult for him that he first attempted to paint the saint in the church. Matthew was said to have been martyred while saying Mass, and he attempted to paint the architectural background of the church and found it too difficult. He abandoned it and turned to the scene on the left, the calling of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew it says, Jesus saw a man, Matthew, at the seat in the custom house and said to him, "Follow me," and Matthew rose and followed him. So what does Caravaggio do? But he places the scene in one of the rough taverns that he's familiar with. It's not absolutely clear whether it's inside or outside. It could be on the street outside. You've just got that window and the rough wall and this table. And you can see he's reused characters from the earlier pictures. The character with his back to us and the one opposite him in their brightly coloured clothes are like the characters from the card shops earlier. And Matthew sits, the light falls across from the right-hand side onto Matthew's face. You might notice also Jesus stands at the right. There's a very faint halo over his head. Beside him is Peter, and he holds his hand out pointing at Matthew, and that hand is a reference to Michelangelo's Hand of Adam on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's a direct quotation. The man at the end of the table on the extreme left doesn't even notice what's happening. He's counting out his money. He's not looking at what's happening. He's like the innkeeper in the supper at Emmaus, the unconverted. He hasn't seen. He hasn't noticed anything. There's very strong chiaroscuro with that light from the right directly illuminating Matthew's face. And again, the theme is one of redemption, because Matthew, as a tax collector, one might agree or not, was seen as a sinner. And the viewer again intended to be in the place of Matthew being called to follow Christ. So having done that to his satisfaction, he returned to the martyrdom scene. And his new approach was to pare down the setting. And he would stick with this for the rest of his life. No extraneous detail. Just the altar is suggested by 3 little steps and a couple of lighted candles. He used an irrational light. In other words, the light's not coming from any particular source or any particular place. It seems to be in the middle of the painting. And it centres around the 3 figures at the centre, the executioner, the semi-nude figure of the executioner, connected by his arm to the saint lying prostrate on the ground. And then this other semi-nude figure on the left-hand side, who's one of a group of people around a pool in the foreground. And they're the people, the converted, awaiting baptism. It's full immersion baptism they're going to get in the pool. The executioner is beautifully lit. A little boy flees off to the right-hand side, and again we have the self-portrait. If you look to the left, at the rear, there are two figures fleeing. Can you see them? And one is looking back over his shoulder. Now, if you look at him, he has a cloak around his upper body, but his lower body is naked. So we take it he was one of the people awaiting baptism, but is fleeing in terror. That's, again, a self-portrait of Caravaggio. This has become such a motif with him to put himself into the pictures. And it almost acts like a biography. You could almost read the story of his life through the pictures. It was a huge success, and he gained a reputation and further commissions. He would have gained a reputation from this because the earlier pictures were in private collections. The public wouldn't have seen them. But now he's on show to the public of Rome. But his future would not be plain sailing. There was a big difference between what was acceptable in a private collection and what was acceptable for public taste. And altarpieces had to fit the theology and the requirements of the church. It would be difficult for Caravaggio conform to the church's demand for decorous and appropriate works. I just want to show you the Contarelli chapel in reality, this picture's in situ, because you can see in the calling scene on the left how he has directed the light to mimic the light from the tall window. So he's actually using the real light of the space. And but it's very interesting to wonder how such dark pictures would have been seen and appreciated in what would have been a candle lit. Today there's a little coin-operated box that turns on a light so that you can see them. But people at Mass would have been sitting in very poor light, and presumably it would have been effective. These figures would have loomed out of the dark. So where he places the strongest light would have been visible, and everything else would have just melded into the background. The St. Matthew and the Angel came later than the other two pictures and was painted to replace a statue that had been rejected. So it wasn't only Caravaggio's work that was rejected. A Flemish artist called Jacques Cobert made a statue for it, and it was rejected. Another cardinal in the Del Monte circle was Girolamo Mattei, and he and his brothers Ciriaco and Asdrubale, they lived in a series of palazzi. They had one each. It was called the Isola dei Mattei, the island of the Matteis, and it took up a whole quarter of Rome with interlinking palazzos. And it was for him, here we go. It was in the Palazzo Mattei that he painted these two pictures, not for the cardinal, but for his brother Ciriaco. He was by now commanding high prices, and this is one of the key reasons why these paintings are so good, because Mattei was a very wealthy man. He gave him sufficient time and funds, probably assistance, probably a studio, as well as his room and board, as well as paying him a lot, enabling Caravaggio to work well and carefully in a protected environment. So he was not looking over his shoulder, and he's not worrying about where he's going to make the rent. Del Monte could never have afforded the prices that Mattei was prepared to pay. Also, Mattei was a very distinguished collector. I've already said how he was a very erudite and learned man, and knew what he wanted and presumably discussed it at length with the artist. You may have read in the paper a few years ago about a second taking of Christ that was found somewhere in Italy and had come to light. And it was quite similar to this one. And that was very common. And people would begin to say, oh, which is the real one? Is the Dublin one the real one? Is this one the fake? Neither of them were fakes. It was very common practice at the time, because there were all these collectors showing each other their works, for people to say, I want one too. Can you do one for me? And so they would toss out another couple of pictures to earn some money. And in fact, Mario Minetti very often helped Caravaggio with the copies. Now, a turning point happened in 1605 when Pope Clement VIII died. The new Pope, Leo XI, lasted only a few months. So in the space of a year, there was a third pope who was a Borghese pope, and he became Pope Paul V. His nephew, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, was one of those who liked Caravaggio's art. But the official style of art that the church preferred would change. Nevertheless, the Cardinal introduced Caravaggio to the Pope, and he painted his portrait. And this was another stroke of luck, because then he got a commission for an altarpiece for the chapel of the Palafrenieri, which were the papal grooms, and they had a chapel in no less a place than St. Peter's Basilica. And they wanted an altarpiece to depict the Virgin and Child together with St. Anne, the Virgin's mother. And again, Caravaggio used one of his prostitutes to model for the Virgin, this time Lena, and he paints her as a very voluptuous young woman, while St. Anne is shown as a quite shriveled, frail old woman enveloped in darkness. There's no drama here as there were in the earlier scenes, because it's really an allegory, but it's an allegory of a very specific point of theological difference between Catholicism and the Reformed Church. It's from Genesis, where God curses the serpent and says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now, Catholics regarded Mary as the second Eve, who through Jesus would redeem man from original sin and so undo the evil done in the Garden of Eden. So that gives Mary a participatory role in the salvation of mankind. But this was refuted by the teaching of Martin Luther, who preached that Christ alone could redeem mankind. So the cult of the Virgin Mary was one of the most divisive things between the Catholic and Protestant churches. Now, Caravaggio genuinely wanted to do his best for this. This was the commission he would have longed for, to get an altarpiece into St. Peter's. And he really wanted to do a very decorous and holy piece of work. But 2 days after it was put in place, it was removed. And the confraternity who had commissioned it sold it to Cardinal Borghese. Whenever anything was refused, there was always a cardinal sitting ready to buy up the rejects. Why was it rejected? The portrayal of St. Anne, who was their patron saint, was she too withered and old and placed in shadow? But he placed her in shadow to contrast her with the radiance of the Virgin and Child. So he's connecting the Virgin and Child together in their role in the story in a very Catholic way. The Virgin, was she too real and contemporary? I mean, she's got her child's foot on her foot, like as if they're playing that walking along game, like any mother you might see with a baby. Was it the baby's nudity? The mother's sexiness? But she's a young mother. He wanted to show a virgin who ordinary mothers would identify with. So her full breasts are entirely appropriate in keeping with who she is in life. And as I say, his attempt was sincere at holiness, but unacceptable in the higher religious circles of the Catholic Church. The Death of the Virgin on the right-hand side had been commissioned in 1601, and it had taken him years to complete it. And this was really because of his personal life. His personal life had become erratic, and it had taken him all that time to apply himself. But this church was, it was Santa Maria della Scala, and it had been built by Clement to house a miraculous icon of the Virgin, who was supposed to help women who prayed for safe delivery of their babies. And the church was built on the site of a former place, which was a house of correction for prostitutes. So it has a very rich female history, and it was home to the order of the Discalced Carmelites. So those were the Carmelites who went without shoes. They were one of the new orders who were dedicated to the veneration of the Madonna and the saints, and the care of the poor. And that is what Caravaggio gave them. He gave them a picture of the Roman poor. Catholic theology decreed that Mary ascended bodily into heaven after her death. Well, actually, soul first, body after, if that's... According to the Golden Legend, which was the medieval source book for the lives of the saints, the apostles clustered around her deathbed, though, in fact, they would have been scattered around the world by that time. Peter is at her feet, John at her head, in the centre is Paul. Mary has just the faintest of halos to denote her sanctity, but as you can see, she's a very ordinary looking dead woman. In fact, she was a prostitute, Anna Cherubini, who had drowned in the Tiber, and there were contemporary reports of her having drowned in the Tiber. And I mean, Caravaggio really gives us a body of a woman who's just been dragged out of a river and is lying on her deathbed with her bare feet and her pallid skin. So this completely contradicted the theology of her having been assumed into heaven. Now, actually, it was the subject of debate at the time whether she died first and was assumed, or whether she was assumed alive. And paintings usually depicted her being assumed alive because it looked nicer, it looked prettier. She had her eyes open and she was looking heavenward, and there were chubby angels around her. It was only in 1997 that John Paul II declared that she actually died first. So Caravaggio got it right. The painting has quite a provenance, a very interesting provenance. It was purchased by the Duke of Mantua on the advice of Rubens, who was then in Italy, and said, "This has been rejected, there's a great painting going if you want to buy it." Later it came into the collection of the English King Charles I. After his execution, it was sold to King Louis XIV in France. After his execution, it was an unlucky painting, obviously. It went to the French state, and there it belongs now. It's in the Louvre. Now, just to show you what they wanted, what they preferred. Thank you, Alistair. It was immediately replaced by Carlo Saraceni's painting of the same subject, but he painted the one in the middle. And if you can see, she's still looking a bit dead. She has her halo, she has the church architecture behind her, she has the adoring saints all around her, but this was also rejected. And he had to paint another version, and the one on the right was the acceptable version. Eyes open, being assumed into heaven with choirs of angels. And that was the style which was becoming acceptable. So after these two works of the Madonna were rejected, Caravaggio's commissions began to diminish, and events conspired to cause his downfall and eventual flight from Rome. From about 1604 onwards, he was living in rented accommodation, frequently broke and out looking for trouble and causing trouble. He was arrested and imprisoned many times for street brawling, assault, including serious assault with an axe, slander, breaking curfew, carrying illegal weapons. As I said, he favoured the sword and was a skilled swordsman, but he also carried a dagger. Throwing a plate of artichokes at a waiter. It's still on the statute book in Rome. And the most curious and specific crime of deturpatio, which is defacement of a house. And that was a very specific thing. If somebody insulted you, you went around to there and threw rocks or mud or excrement or whatever vile thing you could lay your hand on at their doors and windows. It was specifically for somebody who had given insult. So he had a long-running feud with the aforementioned Ranuccio Tommasoni, who was a pimp of all those girls, and had a grudge against Caravaggio, probably over the women. The other point that caused him trouble was artistically, Guido Reni from Bologna was the new boy in town, and he was a classicist, concerned with idealism and beauty, and again, lots of angels. And it would become suited to the more opulent, full Baroque style, which would then result in those churches that when you go on holidays and you visit now, they seem utterly over-decorated to our eyes sometimes. This is his Massacre of the Innocents, a subject not done by Caravaggio, but imagine if he had, he'd have given us a scene of blood and guts and horror. But the age of Catholic austerity was over, and Catholicism was moving away from that message of simple piety of what was called its pauperist wing. Caravaggio was losing status, and with it he was losing his own equilibrium. So 1606 was the fateful year. There were celebrations afoot in Rome for the anniversary of the Pope's election, and Caravaggio and his friends are out and about, and the story is always centred near a tennis court, and you think, tennis courts don't normally go with brawling and duelling. But a fight broke out between Caravaggio and 3 friends, and Tommasoni and 3 of his friends. And as Andrew Graham Dixon argues, 4 against 4 looks like a prearranged fight more than a spontaneous fight. Anyway, whatever happened, it's unclear, but Caravaggio in the course of the fight killed Tommasoni. And one of his own friends, is badly wounded. And in fear, he flees Rome and hides in the hills in the territory of the Colonna family, who are still standing by him. Clearly, that woman had a very strong relationship with Caravaggio's mother, because she just saw this boy as the troubled child of her friend. He continues to paint, however, on the run with simpler pared down compositions, because he has to do it quickly, he has to do it easily with very little equipment. And the darkness becomes darker and darker and darker. He first went to Naples, which was the capital of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, which was ruled by the Spanish. Bigger and more cosmopolitan than Rome, and independent of Rome. Again, there's a Colonna family presence in Naples, where he was warmly regarded and welcomed, regardless of his past crimes. And he was celebrated by the artistic community too. And in fact, in Naples, he received many commissions, and he very deeply influenced a whole generation of painters. That's where his influence was greatest. And through Naples, the influence went to Holland, because both places were ruled by Spain, and so there was passage between them. He painted this very curious work called The 7 Acts of Mercy for the Monte della Misericordia, again a charity founded by noblemen for the relief of the poor and a hospital for incurables. And they built a new church and needed an altarpiece. The idea of the 6 acts of mercy comes from the gospel. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was hungry, etc., etc. That's 6 things. The 7th was the burial of the dead, which was a particular duty of this charity. So he gives us in this work secularized versions of saints or biblical scholars, characters rather. The young nobleman at the centre with the feathered hat and the cloak he's representing St. Martin, who cut his cloak in half to give to the poor. The brawny workman behind him is drinking water from the jawbone of an ass. He's representing Samson, who drank from the well and was revived, from the story in Judges. The innkeeper with the light welcomes the stranger, and in front of him a man is carrying a corpse through the doorway, feet first. That's the burial of the dead. The strangest figure is the figure of the young woman in the front right, who is suckling an old man. He's in prison, through the bars of the prison. He has taken that from the story of Cimon and Pero from ancient Roman legend, and it represents the act of ultimate filial piety. And it's really strange to our eyes, but it became a hugely popular subject in Baroque art. And actually, if any of you have read John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, it ends with exactly the same scene set in a barn. This painting was very successful. Everything he did in Naples was successful and brought him lots of commissions, and he could have settled there and he could have made a very successful career. But he suddenly departed for Malta. He arrived there to be welcomed by the Knights of the Order of St. John. They were seen as defenders of Catholicism in the Mediterranean, having successfully fought off Suleiman the Magnificent in the Siege of Malta in 1565. And they built a new capital, Valletta, which had hotels for every nation of travellers. And they dedicated themselves to the care of the sick. It was culturally French, with Italian architecture, and famous or infamous for its Greek courtesans. So Caravaggio would have been delighted to hear on landing that there was still lots of brawling and street fighting going on. On one occasion, a riot broke out when the abbot tried to clear the city of loose women. The Grand Master of the Knights was a Frenchman called Alof de Vignacourt, and again, there's a Colonna connection because one of her sons, who led a life very similar to Caravaggio's of crimes and misdemeanors, had been exiled to Malta by the Pope, and he spent 4 years in prison there. But after he got out of prison, he became a captain of the galleys, and he probably brought Caravaggio to Malta on one of his ships. So he was welcomed. He painted lots of portraits for them. And eventually, and unbelievably, he was initiated into the order. He took the robes. Now, the normal requirement to become a knight of the Order of St. John was to have 200 years of nobility on all 4 of your ancestral lines, to pay a huge dowry, and to complete a term of military service. Anyone unchaste or had committed murder were automatically barred. So what did they do? They appealed to the Pope on Caravaggio's behalf, and lo and behold, he was accepted and became a knight a year after his arrival. The theory would have been he stayed in the Italian hotel, worked at the hospital, and prayed all day, as if. He didn't take any vows, but he promised to be a good Christian and to do good works. And here comes the rub. He was free to paint, which is, of course, what they wanted him for all the time. Every one of the knights had their portraits painted by him. And then he painted this wonderful picture, which is still in the oratory of the Cathedral of St. John in Valletta. And it is thought that this might have been painted as his dowry, because he wouldn't have had the money to pay the dowry. Of course, we know John the Baptist, Herod ordered him to be beheaded at the request of Salome in payment for her dance, who presented the head to her mother Herodias. making him the first Christian martyr. And of course, he was the patron saint of the Knights of the Order of St. John. He was also a forerunner of Christ, who would suffer a similarly gruesome fate. And Caravaggio sets the scene in a prison yard as a bleak theatrical tableau where you have this very muscular executioner holding down John by the head as he severs his dagger behind his back. He's about to sever the head, and the woman on the right waiting to receive it on a platter to present to Salome. No angels intervene. This is just human beings at their grisly work. And he even signed his name, if you see right at the bottom in the middle, in the blood flowing from John's neck, he signed his name. He's beginning, I think, at this stage to identify with these gruesome martyrdoms. He was becoming paranoid. He enjoyed fame and success in Malta, and yet again, there's a pattern. After 4 months, he quarrelled violently with another knight and was imprisoned, managed somehow to escape, went to Sicily, where his old friend Mario Minetti was now living a comfortable and successful life as an artist. Again, he's welcomed. But you see, you have to remember that all of these places are independent from each other. They all are autonomous places, and so the laws don't extend from one to the other. Everybody in Sicily wanted a painting by Caravaggio, but his behaviour became, and he painted very many, and many still in situ, but his behaviour became even more erratic, and he was now openly being described as not just curious or peculiar, but as mad. He was unbalanced, fearful. He slept with his dagger at the ready. His style became ever darker, reflecting his mental state. In the city of Messina, he painted the raising of Lazarus for the chapel of the Padri Crociferi, the carriers of the cross. Again, people who took care of the sick. And of course, as we know in the Gospel, Lazarus, the brother of Martha and Mary, who has died, and the sisters go to Jesus to intervene, and he comes and orders the stone to be removed and orders Lazarus to walk again. You can see the character just to the right of Jesus actually lifting what looks like a great slab of paving stone. And the stone was taken to represent the weight of sin. But what Caravaggio gives us is not a beautifully decorous man waking up from a sleep. He gives us a body struggling to come back to life, as if to suggest that the journey from sin to salvation is undertaken reluctantly, to pass from darkness into light as an unbelievably heavy burden. It was another great success, and he was now receiving commissions that stipulated that he could work according to the ideas of the painter. In other words, paint what you like, how you like, in whatever manner you want. We just want something by the most famous painter in Italy, most infamous painter in Italy as well. He was still referring to himself as a Knight of Malta, but he soon would be officially defrocked in absentia in Malta under the very painting of the beheading of John the Baptist that he had put into the oratory, which was also the courtroom. They would have a trial, and they had to strip the robe from a chair, seeing as he was not there to take it from his body. Again, he just suddenly left and went to Naples. So, was his trip to Sicily the whirlwind visit of a celebrity painter, or was it the flight of a fugitive on the run? It was probably a bit of elements of both. Certainly, he was by now entirely paranoid. He was afraid of Rome. He was afraid of the Maltese Knights. He was afraid of the Tomasoni clan. He was perhaps scared of his own conscience. He had been 3 years in exile. But this is the curious thing. He confidently expected a pardon from the Pope, and he was right to do so because 3 years was seen as an appropriate length of exile for having committed a capital crime. So it is quite likely that that would have come right for him. He was, as always, welcomed back by the Marchesa Colonna to Naples, where he went for her aid. But shortly after arriving there, he was badly wounded in the face in yet another fight in a famous restaurant called the Osteria del Ceriglio, which was in fact an infamous brothel as well as a restaurant. And he was attacked when he came out of that place by 4 men. Now, in Andrew Graham Dixon's book, he argues convincingly that this was not just a fight, this was an ambush, that they were after him, that he was right. The paranoia had been, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean there aren't people after me. And that he was sfregiato. The sfregio, the cut on is what they did to him. Now, he argues convincingly again that it was the Knight of Malta that he had fought with that had followed him and caught up with him in Naples. And that is convincing because if anybody had wanted to kill Caravaggio, 4 men could have killed him, but they chose to mark him, which was the sign of, you have insulted me, and I will mark you. So the mood of his paintings becomes ever darker. As I say, because he's on the run, he has to paint quickly, he has to paint with economy of means. He wouldn't have many possessions with him. And so he's painting pictures like this, David with the head of Goliath. This one he painted and sent to Cardinal Borghese in Rome. And it's a kind of a supplicating plea for forgiveness. Because he's painted his own features on the decapitated head of Goliath, which is a really bizarrely gruesome thing to do. But as I say, his identification is ever more with the martyred figures. In July 1610, he left for Rome. He was given safe passage from the Spanish in Naples, boarded a ship, and he probably at this stage had news that the pardon had or would come very soon. He brought 3 paintings with him for Cardinal Borghese. He disembarked at the tiny fortress port of Pola outside Rome, which was a Spanish garrison. And there, either by accident, it is said, or by overzealousness, he was imprisoned. Briefly, a couple of days. He managed to bribe his way out, but the ship had gone on. And with it, the 3 precious paintings, which were his kind of bribe to the Borghese. The next port of call for the ship was the fishing village of Port Ercole. And he had been sick when he left Naples from the terrible attack. The area was malarial. He had been on the run for months. By the time he arrived at Port Ercole, he was mortally ill and collapsed and died. Now, there was no record of his death, and so it was never known whether he did or didn't die there. But there was no record of his death because the priest was on strike, and there were no records of any deaths there in the summer of 1610. So it's pretty reliable that he died in Porto Ercole. There's me in Porto Ercole on his monument last September. And it's a peculiar looking thing that they've put up to Caravaggio, this funny standing stone. But behind where I'm sitting is a kind of a still life. And trust the Italians, look at the size of the dagger. It's, Port Ercole is a lovely little sort of fishing town, bigger than a village, a small town, very near where my father was from. So that's why we happened to be there and visiting Caravaggio. So just to have a final look at our paintings and to sum up what we have discussed. Caravaggio was largely self-taught as an artist. He was, as we've seen, a devoted naturalist, always working from the model. When they had a broken finger, he put in the broken finger. But he was not merely a naturalist, and he often, as we've seen, subtly and naturalistically included complex theology, iconography, and symbolism in his paintings. He was the premier artist of the Catholicism of the Counter-Reformation. He identified with the austere, pauperist wing of Catholicism that made a link between the poverty of the original disciples and the care of the poor and sick in contemporary Rome. He had powerful and influential friends who often saved him from prison and bought his rejected canvases, but he was never in the inner circle of the church, and artistic taste changed, his style went out of fashion. He was revived, interest in him was revived in the 20th century, of course, because he's seen as a modern, romantic figure. He had a very troubled personality. As his life disintegrated, the work became ever darker, a darkness that seemed not to be just aesthetic, but also spiritual. He was both sacred and profane, not by turns, but at one and the same time. He was a sinner, but he was very sincere about the possibility of redemption. And finally, I always say a caveat about art history. I hope I've given you some information and context which might help you to understand the paintings more fully. But always remember that every painting has within it what it has to tell you. And as a viewer, you have your own response to it. And I really recommend you to go and just sit and look at these wonderful paintings and take what you will, let them speak to you. So that's all I have to say about Caravaggio, but I want to share one little insight with you before I go about my sort of 6 degrees of separation to, if you will, to Caravaggio. At about the time that the painting went on show in the National Gallery of Ireland, which was 1993, I was teaching a night class in a Dublin college. And there was a married couple in my class. And one night I talked about this painting, and they started laughing. It was the Taking of Christ. And they started laughing. So that's our picture, that's our picture. So I had to stop the whole class and say, you have to tell us the story now. Why is that your picture? So the picture for Ciriaco Mattei stayed in the Mattei family for 200 years. But at some point, the attribution changed, and it was said to be by Gerrit van Honthorst, who was a Dutch follower of Caravaggio. He was probably more in fashion at the time. They wanted it to be by him. In 1802, it was sold to a Scottish collector, and it remained in his family for 119 years. Then it was sold in rapid succession in 1921, 1922, and again in 1924, at which time it was bought by an Irish woman called Dr. Marie Lee Wilson. And she was a devout Irish Catholic, but she was married to a Protestant man, Percival Lee Wilson, and he was a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary. He had fought in the First World War with the Royal Irish Rifles, and he was also involved in the arrest of the insurgents in the Easter Rising in 1916. In 1920, he was shot dead by the IRA in Gorey, County Wexford, where they lived, as a retaliation for that. She was distraught, and on one of her holidays to Scotland, she bought the picture, which she kept with her, and then sometime in the 1930s, she gave it to the priest who had comforted her at the time of her husband's death. He was called Thomas Finlay, S.J., and he was Professor of Political Economy at UCD. It was his grandnephew, also called Tom Finlay, that was in my class and said, "That's my picture." Because he had a 90-something-year-old aunt still living down the country somewhere who said, "That's our picture, it doesn't belong to the National Gallery." So in 1990, the Jesuits asked Sergio Benedetti, who was the senior conservator of the National Gallery, to come in and have a look at their paintings, just to see were they worth anything. And lo and behold, he spotted what was then known as the lost Caravaggio, because it had been documented, but nobody knew where it was. And here it was in the Jesuit house in Baggot Street in Dublin. And they gave it on indefinite loan to the National Gallery, where it still hangs. So that's my little connection, all of our connection actually in this country, to the Caravaggio. I'm sorry for having sort of gone over time, but thank you for listening to me. And you're going to use, I think Margaret is going to say a few words about the charity for whom we're making a collection this evening. Thank you so much.